Welcome back to PLS 510. Today I'm going to discuss the forage considerations for small ruminants. And I do want to give Ken Andrews, Dr. Ken Andrews at the Kentucky State University, a big thank you for most of the material that went into this lecture. So first of all, what are small ruminants? For our purposes, we are going to consider small ruminants to be sheep and goats. If you think about comparing them to cattle, their digestive systems are in general the same. They are ruminants, but they have different grazing preferences and abilities than cattle. In general, they are able to graze closer and are more selective in their grazing than cattle. And in general, they also require a higher quality diet to meet their needs due to the smaller rumen capacity and smaller GI capacity. Ruminants can be very valuable in a grazing system. You can carry more animals in head per acre. We recommend stocking rates of 3 to 5 head per acre with sheep or goats. We can also take advantage of their different grazing preferences. Alternative grazing practices and locations are possible. This includes enterprises which include the grazing of invasive species. We can also co-graze with other species, in particular cattle, to improve our pasture quality and our productivity. And like with cattle, better management with sheep and goats results in better productivity in the form of greater returns, greater gains, improved utilization, and with sheep and goats, improved animal health. And we'll talk about that. And especially, I'm thinking here of internal parasites. If you want to look at the grazing preferences in a little more detail of sheep and goats versus cattle, first of all, cattle, if you look at their diet in general, when these are available, they're about 80% grass, and about the rest of the diet is a mix of forbs and browse. And browse is just more of the taller growing species like ironweed, like bushes, brambles, and so on. Sheep actually would consume a little less grass and more forbs and browse, and goats will consume even a smaller proportion of grass and greatly prefer the browse in their diet, the briars and the brambles and taller growing broadleaf materials. So small ruminants are complementary grazers to cattle. Combining these different species on the same acre can improve overall productivity per acre and or increase utilization. When we want to think about managing forage for small ruminants or the forages that work for small ruminants, first of all of the forage principles that we think of for cattle will apply to small ruminants. The differences will occur with fencing, and we'll talk just briefly about that, as well as predator issues, and those we will not talk about, but predator issues are a concern with sheep and goats, obviously. And of course, we've already mentioned forage preferences. Sheep and goats have different grazing patterns than cattle in that they tend not to move into heavy cover rapidly, and where this comes into play most often is the use of the taller growing summer annuals. A mix of cool and warm season forages will be the most effective in overall management and production for sheep and goats. And when we look at the forage choices open to us, the low growing forages can reinfect with internal parasites or are more prone to reinfect with internal parasites. So that means species like bluegrass and Bermuda grass in particular, which are very low growing, need to be used carefully for animals that are susceptible to reinfection with internal parasites. And both annual and perennial forages are easily utilizable for small ruminants. And I should stop here and mention just a little bit more about internal parasites in sheep and goats. It is such a concern because there's a tendency to have a lot of resistance to the deworming products that are on the market. So we have a problem there. Since they graze very close to the ground, They can reinfect with worms that wind up germinating on the forage from their manure, from the eggs in the manure. And so we have to be careful, especially with younger animals, with growing animals, that we are managing their internal parasite load through the use of deworming products, through the use of possibly Sericea lespedeza, as we'll see in a moment, and also by how we graze the forages that we have. I said we'd talk briefly about fencing, and I mean very briefly. In general, we need to have a lot more wires to keep in sheep and goats. And in particular, we need to have wires close to the ground. And so regular woven wire fence, or in this case, you've got a woven wire electrical fence for sheep that work very well. With goats, because of their horns, many times the spacing between the wires will need to be taller to keep the animals from becoming caught with their horns in the fence. But in general, the fence needs to go all the way to the ground. If we want to think about grazing systems for small ruminants, we're going to want to, as with cattle, to try to incorporate some sort of rotational system. Fencing, of course, is the key to that, and temporary electric fencing is effective in grazing systems, but we may need to have more wires with small ruminants. Woven wire that meets the ground is important as an external fence because sheep and goats will go under a fence very readily. As we mentioned, internal parasites are a problem, and here's a little more information about that. The life cycle from egg to infection stage larvae is only 14 days. So in one way to manage pastures to minimize internal parasites, of course, is to not have a grazing period longer than 2 weeks. And if we think back to the kinds of systems that are best for rotational grazing anyway, we'd love to keep the grazing period to be a week or less, not always possible. We also need to try to lower the parasite load with our grazing systems by having a longer rest period. And unfortunately, this rest period can be anywhere between almost 3 to 4 months long, depending on the weather. And of course, hot, dry weather is more conducive to having parasite perishing on the pasture and to be able to get back on that pasture sooner. So quite obviously, you can't have enough paddocks to have this many days of rest. So we've got to have a multi-pronged approach to dealing with parasites that would include using any deworming products that are effective, grazing more erect species, and as we'll see, possibly using Sericea lespedeza more in the system. And one other thing to keep in mind is that when we harvest for hay, we will effectively remove most of the parasites from that field. So it is a good way to clean up a field. So I said we talked a little bit more about Sericea lespedeza, and this is going to be the summary of that. Sericea lespedeza, just for review, is a warm season perennial legume that is well suited to grow on a lot of different kinds of soils in Kentucky, in particular the low fertility sites like the reclaimed mineland, which is that picture on the right. In a recent article by Dr. Tom Terrell at West Virginia, not West Virginia, pardon me, it's Fort Valley State University, he and his co-writers found that Sericea pasture, hay, leaf meal, pellets, or silage have shown some level of anti-parasitic activity against gastrointestinal nematodes and parasitizing protozoa. So Sericea lespedeza can be a great asset to our small ruminant system. And in fact, I think in general, Sericea lespedeza is an untapped resource for us. Most people consider it to be a problematic invasive weed that is of no value except for conservation. But in the case of sheep and goats, it can be very useful. We talked about the desirability of rotational grazing with sheep and goat. This is a study done at Kentucky State University where they had compared continuous to rotational grazing in May and June and looked at the resulting species of grass, clover weeds, and bare soil. The point I want to make is that moving or rotating pastures tended to lessen the tall fescue prevalence in the pasture and increase the prevalence of more desirable grasses like bluegrass and orchard grass. And that happened in both the May rotation and the July rotation. If you want to think about goats in cattle pastures, this can be a very useful co-grazing situation in that many cattle pastures have increased forbs and browse plants over time, and we typically refer to those as weeds. And goats, of course, preferentially graze many of these plants, as do sheep. In some observations that we made in Carter County, when we grazed cattle and sheep together, the grass populations increased in the lower and middle canopies during 3 years of goat grazing on cattle pastures, and the bramble cover significantly decreased in the first year alone as goats targeted these plants. So goats resulted in better grazing than for cattle, in addition to finding feed for themselves. So co-grazing of cattle with goats or sheep can increase utilization of pasture and result in higher production per acre. In general, we say that adding one doe or ewe per cow can be done on cattle farms without impacting cattle productivity or increasing the land needed for the pasture. I'd like to talk a moment about prescribed grazing for land management using sheep and goats, and oftentimes that's goats. And we call it prescribed or contract grazing, and that's grazing by goats and sheep for managing undesirable plants. And this is sometimes done and often done as a contract or as a commercial venture where a producer with an area to clean up can contract with individuals to bring sheep or goats in to remove those undesirable species. This targets specific plant species and is a source of income for some goat and sheep producers. Grazing can reduce fire risk as well as assisting in the control of invasive species. In a trial at Purdue, as you can see, with 1 year of grazing in a woodlot, multiflora rose cover was reduced by 8 to 10% and spice bush by 12 to 16% with goats. So as we summarize forage considerations for small ruminants, as with cattle, proper grazing management is the key to profitable small ruminant production, and rotational grazing is more important with small ruminants due to the parasite issues that we have. Co-grazing with cattle can improve productivity per acre, and different species preferences for sheep and goats compared to cattle mean that we're able to remove those forbs and browse from those pastures. Sheep and goats do prefer a variety in their diet, and prescribed grazing to control weeds is an additional use for sheep and goats and can improve cattle pastures. Thank you very much.